Now, once you get going using Spark with Cassandra and you really get to know the RDD API and you become productive, it might occur to you that you're doing a lot of the kinds of things that you might have done in SQL in a smaller database. Well, to that end, Spark gives us Spark SQL. It's a relational engine built on top of Spark. As a starting point, we'll have a few new objects that we'll interact with at the Spark shell and in our Spark applications. Without Spark SQL, we've just used the Spark context. Well, now we'll have the Cassandra SQL context, the SQL context, and the Hive context to play around with. We're also going to introduce a very important new abstraction, the DataFrame. We'll dig into those in a little bit of detail. Ultimately, though, we're going to be able to produce structured SQL queries just like we would have in a smaller database. Let's take a look at the basics. The Cassandra SQL context is the entry point we're going to use in most of our examples. It's another native object available to us in the Spark shell. Instead of being called SC, it's called CSC. And on the slide there's a little bit of a standalone application that you can look at where we create a Cassandra SQL context in addition to the Spark context that we would have had if we weren't using Spark SQL. Likewise, that Hive context object called HC in the Spark shell, that's available to you in the DataStax Enterprise Spark shell. If you need to execute any Hive QL queries, you can use that guy. And again, there's code here that shows you how you would instantiate one of those in a standalone Spark application. We're not going to spend a bunch of time with Hive context. We're going to be focusing on the Cassandra SQL context, but this is here in case you need it. Now, I mentioned data frames as a new programming abstraction in Spark SQL. You can think of a data frame like an RDD that has named columns. So it's like if you took a relational database table and an RDD and merged them together, you'd get a data frame. So it's a lot like a table. It has schema, it has rows, it has columns with names and data types. Like an RDD, it's distributed and Spark manages where it lives and how computation is distributed over it. You can see on the slide here, we actually create a data frame by calling the SQL method on the Cassandra Spark context object, passing it a simple query. We haven't really gone over any of this, but you can see, trivially, that's executing a query and getting some results back. And those results come back in terms of this data frame type. And if you look at the output there, you can see it's a collection of column names and data types. Clearly, we'll dig into that API a bit more as we move through this module. A bit more explicitly, here is how to execute a straight SQL query on the Cassandra SQL context object. Simply pass the string in, and there we're done. Now that's going to return a data frame. We're calling a method called show. We'll look at that in its particulars later on, but show is just going to print out in tabular form the results of the query. That's just one example of an action we can call on a data frame object, analogous to an action that you'd call on an RDD. They really do have a lot of similarities. Now here's what we're calling a language integrated query. You might, by looking at the code, think language integrated is a euphemism for difficult, but really it isn't. This is using the API of the Cassandra SQL context to express the same query that we had expressed in just raw SQL before. On the Cassandra SQL context object, we call the read method, which tells us that we're going to create a data frame. And then we specify the format of that data frame. We're saying this is going to be a query from a Cassandra table by passing in the class that you see in that third line there. Then we pass it some options, which really are just the key space in the table. It ends up being a select star from that table, and then we load the results in. And then having created that data frame, we can do some other things to it. We can effectively apply the filter transformation, which is like a where clause on a SQL query. Then an aggregation transformation. We're asking to count everything, and just returning that count as the result, finally calling the show action like we saw in the slide earlier, printing out that result. So for this example, this looks like a much more painful way of doing something that was so easily expressed in CQL just a little bit ago. But there will be cases where we're really glad we have this API and we're able to program data frames directly this way. And if you had a Hive QL query you wanted to execute, you'd do it this way on the HC object. In this case, it looks just like SQL, just like CQL, so no big surprises here, but the API for the HC object is very similar.